back for what is the last of this year's Toxic Free Talks here at Master in Geneva, with the current Special Rapporteur on the mandate working on toxics and human rights. It has been a long day today. With this is the fourth event we are hosting. And we have discussed many different topics already in the three events that we have hosted today. So we look forward to the discussion. Marcus, I know you are going to be on the mandate a few more months, and we will definitely miss you. But you have already also announced that your successor will be able to handle a few more topics. So we are delighted to have been able to start these talks with you a few years ago already, and during COVID times, and we look forward to continue them with your different successors. It sounds a bit strange that I said that at the beginning of an event. And so with that, I leave you in the hands of Yves Lador, the big mind behind a lot of the things that we do in these talks. Yves is the, I think everybody here knows Yves is the Geneva representative of Earth Justice.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diana, and thank you for this introduction. And indeed, this is the last, at least for this session of the Council, the last day of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. Probably it's not the last Toxic Free Talks, but we will have the Marcus Orellana still as Special Rapporteur. So the tenure will end only next spring. So probably there's still a few things to do together before we get to the next mandate holder. So we wanted to conclude this day precisely to look forward, to see, to start to have some ideas of what's coming next. And the question is really the challenges to implement the right to be free from toxics, which is one of the great achievements of this mandate, to put this on the table very clearly, the fact that we must be able to live free from toxics. But then, of course, there's a number of strategies questions and a number of challenges, and we are living in a rather difficult context right now. There are a number of challenges we're going to have to overcome in order to make sure that the international law does deliver. And because if it does, it's the number of victims which will just increase. That's exactly what we heard in some of the previous moment. So I propose first to start by an introduction by the Special Rapporteur, Marcus Orellana, and then we will have three reflections that will be focusing on possible instruments to deal with private actors, reflections about how do we see the situation after what happened on the negotiation on plastics, and was it a meaningful event, or are we over emphasizing it? That's going to be one of the questions. And again, like we did this morning, we will be very happy to have the view from the youth groups, the Chemical and Waste Youth Platform, which is one of the great achievements of the recent development in the field of plastics, chemical and waste. So without any further ado, I'll immediately hand over the floor to the Special Rapporteur, Marcus Orellana.
Thank you so much, Yves, and thank you, Diana, for that kind introduction. As you rightly point out, I am entering the last stretch of my tenure in the Toxics and Human Rights mandate, and in doing so, I want to once again thank the Geneva Environment Network for partnering with the mandate over these last few years in convening and disseminating the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. These talks would not be possible, would not have been conceived without Yves Lador from Earth Justice, and so I'm really also very thankful and grateful for the opportunity to partner with you, Yves. And so in this last talk of the day, challenges to implement the right to be free from toxics. Let me offer perhaps three overarching introductory remarks. One is that the right to be free from toxics, as articulated in the title of this talk, is an element of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It is also an element of the right to life and the right to health and various other internationally protected human rights, physical integrity, and so forth. And so in that sense, it is not that we're talking about a new right or an autonomous right, but toxics and the right to be free from toxics engages a number of rights that come together, and it has been one of the driving forces conceptually in my approach and my predecessor's approach to international human rights law. These various rights inform for example, the right to be free from exposure to hazardous substances, the right to be free from toxics. I elaborate on this right as an element of the right to a healthy environment in a joint report produced with the Special Rapporteur, then on the mandate of human rights and the environment. Today, that mandate's name has changed. David Boyd. As I've mentioned in other times, his name is in the report. And this is because of the modalities of the council. I think both of our names should be on it, but that's not the case. In any event, that's the first preliminary remark about the centrality of the right to a healthy environment for this work. Second, on the importance of multilateral environmental agreements and other agreements that carry forward protections in connection with toxics, such as the treaty under negotiation on human rights responsibilities of businesses and transnational corporations, business enterprises. This synergy, this complementarity is something that the General Assembly of the United Nations stressed when it recognized for the first time at the global level, let's not forget its resolution in 2022, speaking of the importance of MEAs for the realization of the right to a healthy environment. And this takes me to a third point. Some argue that MEAs displace human rights law. They exhaust even the content of the right to a healthy environment because they provide more specialized norms and standards in regards to a specific issue. But this line of argumentation has been put to rest, as it were, has been completely rejected recently by the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, first in its advisory opinion on climate change, and more recently by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion on obligations of states in regards to climate change. What comes out of these opinions? That conflicts of norms that would otherwise serve to displace one treaty or another, they do not exist. They cannot be presumed, they do not exist necessarily between human rights and the environment. In the specifics of the ICJ advisory opinion, that treaties on climate change do not displace other sources of international obligations established in various areas of international law. International environmental treaties, international human rights are specifically and explicitly analyzed by the International Court of Justice. So lex posterior, lex specialis, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, they apply, but in a conflict of norms, that is where a state is unable to comply with two obligations at the same time. The obligations established in MEAs and obligations established in international human rights law in regards to the right to a healthy environment, there's no conflict, there's synergy, there's mutual supportiveness, and so there's no displacement. And what this means, among other things, is that the right to a healthy environment coexists with multilateral environmental agreements. And so while the GA is saying there's complementarity and the implementation of MEAs is important for the realization of the right to a healthy environment, the ICJ's analysis is telling us we have varying sets and various sources of obligations that apply to given situations. And when it comes to the right to be free from toxics, I want to stress this because when we see the negotiations on treaty on plastic pollution, there are already baseline obligations in force that are relevant for the global scourge on plastic pollution. That is not to say that a treaty on this matter is not needed. It is sorely needed. My country visit to Samoa demonstrate this very clearly. Samoa at the receiving end of importing poor quality plastics. It needs international cooperation to deal with the global tide, the growing tide of plastics in its territory. And similarly, on the Treaty on Transnational Corporations and Human Rights, I don't know if we conceive it as a multilateral environmental agreement, but besides the label, the obligations that may be established there are also quite needed and would coexist with the obligations on the right to be free from toxics. So those are three observations that I thought I'd put on the table as an introductory matter, and then very interested in hearing various presenters elaborate on the various issues that they will bring to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcos Orellana, for these introductory remarks and food for thought. So, like this morning, let's turn to the new coming generation, active. So, Alison Felipe Moraes Neves. I hope I'm not too mispronouncing your name.
No, it's fine.
Thank you. You're very nice. And you're a member of the Chemical and Waste Youth Platform. And you're actually studying, if I'm correct, at the Goethe University.
I have a fellowship there.
You have a fellowship there. Great. And so it's as we heard this morning with Natalie, it was really interesting to have your involvement in this field. That's not the most attractive field. That's a start. So usually that's not where you will find most of the big youth movements. But definitely considering just taking the issue of the legacy, it's quite important to have you with us and to have you on board. So let's start with you and to see what is your perception, what do you see as the challenges to implement the right to be free from toxics?
Perfect. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here with such a distinguished colleagues. My name is Alison, and I participate as a member of the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform and as a researcher funded by the German Chancellor Fellowship of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. The right to be free from toxics is an issue that I have dedicated myself and my work to, especially regarding mercury pollution from gold mining. I would like to sincerely thank the UN Special Procedures of the Human Rights Council, Geneva Environment Network, and Earth Justice for organizing this important event also, and also my fellow panelists for their inspiring work and collaboration. My academic and professional journey has been focused on this challenge. I'm originally from Brazil, but nowadays I'm based in Germany, working at Goethe University Frankfurt. And since 2021, I have worked to support stronger regulations on chemical management in Brazil through the Environmental Diplomacy Group of the Institute of International Relations and Foreign Trade. In this group, we are researching the gaps between international commitments and national implementation. Our publications, including the book Environmental Diplomacy, and reviews on compliance under multilateral agreements, such as the BRS and the Minamata Conventions. And as we prepare for the Minamata COP in November, I would like to connect mercury pollution with this broader conversation on the right to be free of toxics. Following also the motto of the BRS COPs this year, we must make the invisible visible, and what remains invisible too is often are the experience of people that are facing the harms of chemical pollution. And we have seen that fighting mercury pollution is a race that we are not yet winning. The growing intoxication of our environment and people demands a new perspective, one that connects technology and economics with human rights. These three aspects are not separated issues, but parts of a single complex transition that we need to address. First, combating mercury pollution is not just about banning a substance, it's about especially addressing a technological gap. Yesterday, in the Minamata Regional Preparatory Meeting with the Eastern European countries, which is currently being hosted here in Geneva at the International Environment House, we were discussing how gold extraction without mercury requires technology-based solutions. In some cases, the ban on mercury without providing a safe and viable alternative has led to uncontrolled use of other toxic substances, which can be more difficult to manage and may cause even greater environmental and health damage if misused. And miners sometimes replace one toxic substance with another that is equally or more dangerous. So offering alternatives is insufficient. The alternatives must be safe and accessible. This is not a simple win-win situation. Thousands of small-scale miners in the global south are also socioeconomically vulnerable and rely on mercury-based mining. So those methods they are also using to feed their own families. In my home country of Brazil, many communities are already suffering the consequence of mercury contamination, with indigenous peoples, women, children, and youth being impacted first and worst. These are violations of fundamental human rights, including the rights to health, food, and a clean environment. For children and youth who are most vulnerable to toxic exposures and who must live with their effects on the body the longest. So this is also a matter of intergenerational justice. There are no easy ways to be free from toxins, but the rights are also remain the center of our response. And second, mercury use is driven by economic factors, as I mentioned before. Simply telling miners to stop does not work. We should also create new policies and regulations, but they alone are not enough. We need to shape the realities and the needs of those that are most impacted. A just transition must reshape local economies, especially by providing technology capacity. For instance, vocational training schools focus on mercury-free gold mining and other industry can give people the skills and dignity to earn a living without harming their communities. And this is also investing in a new generation of young professionals who can drive a more sustainable circular economy that focus on chemical safety and minimizing the risks to the environment and the human health. So implementing the right to be free from toxins requires a holistic approach. We need to reshape complex systems with technology, mobilizing society, and listening to stakeholders and their communities. Youth movements like the Chemicals and Waste Youth Platform are key to this effort. We are the youth constituency to the United Nations process on chemicals, waste, and pollution. We represent the voices of young people in these global discussions. Our role is to bring youth directly into the work of international agreements like the BRS conventions, the Minamata Convention, and the Global Framework on Chemicals. And despite being the most impacted population group, the health and rights of children and youth have rarely been explicitly addressed in policy agreements on chemical and waste. Soon, at the Minamata COP on November 2nd, we will propose key recommendations, including a global declaration on chemicals and waste. We have generated interesting early commitments from member states and observer organizations to support the development of children and youth action plans in the multilateral environmental agreements. So, finally, a toxic-free and future for all is possible only by recognizing young people and all rights holders community as experts of lived experience and partners in shaping solutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you to you. It was really very, very interesting. So you are proposing a number of interesting perspectives in reframing a bit the way we put the question. I think this is something we should keep in mind for the different discussion that will follow. Let me turn now to the second topic, and there's really a relation between the two. Of course, in the field of chemicals and waste, you have the state obligations deriving from the international human rights law instruments. But not only that, you also have an issue of the responsibility of private actors, and that's something we always have to deal very, very seriously with. There is an initiative which exists now since almost a decade within the UN system, which has progressed, and which is to try to develop a treaty that would address the responsibilities of transnational cooperation and other business enterprises. So I want to thank you, Francesca Mingrone, for being with us. You're senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law, but actually you're not really here just for Ciel. You're here for a number of organizations, and you'll tell me exactly. I'm sure if I try to do the list, I'm going to forget some of them. So I leave this to you. But a number of organizations have looked precisely at where the treaty is at this moment in the negotiation process, and what are the environmental aspects to it, if I'm correct. So, as I said, thank you for being with us, and we're looking forward to hear the analysis that this group of NGOs has produced.
Thank you so much, Yves, and it's really nice to be here with Marcos and Alison and Andres. Indeed, Marcos was asking, is the draft legally binding instrument a multilateral environmental agreement? And the answer is not enough, unfortunately. We really want to green it. And indeed, in trying to understand how this initiative could advance the question of just transition and really address the triple planetary crisis, we prepared this publication, Ciel, but really was led by FIAN International with contributions by us, Franciscans International, FES, ISHR, and ESCR Net. And really the objective was, on one hand, how to really include environmental dimensions, not just focusing on climate, but really with having in mind this triple planetary crisis. And then ensuring an intersectional approach. Actually, when I was listening to Alison, I did a quick word search, and I noticed that future generations are not mentioned in the draft. So I think that's another point that we should raise to really include them also among the groups that should be helped and protected from corporate harm. And specifically, also, we looked at how the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment can be included in the legally binding instrument. As you were saying, the initiative started in 2014, so it's been a long journey. The environment was not mentioned in the resolution that gave the mandate to create the open-ended intergovernmental working group. But it's been really an important element throughout the iteration of the text and discussions among states. Unfortunately, the current text that we have, which is a very long one, full with a lot of track changes from states, doesn't capture fully the environment and environmental considerations or the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. At the same time, since 2014, many important legal developments have happened. We heard already about the advisory opinions by the International Court of Justice, but we shall not forget, of course, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights advisory opinion as well. That's really reiterated the standing of the right to healthy environment as a self-standing right, but also one that is a precondition and is interconnected with all the other fundamental human rights. And of course, the recognition of the rights itself by the Human Rights Council and then the General Assembly back in 2021 and 2022. So on the back of all of that, the hope is really that at least at the next session in October, states will really build on this and push for stronger language on this dimension. The publication, which is not out yet, but we can share it as soon as it's finalized, really has an article by article approach. We look at all the articles from the preamble or paragraph to the very last article, and we try to understand where we can integrate these elements. I won't go article by article, but I have identified maybe 4 broad dimensions that it could be helpful to have a look at. First of all, how to ensure that the legally binding instrument is consistent with existing legal framework. Marcos was telling us about the importance of this harmonious interpretation of different norms under different bodies of law. Definitely the ICJ advisory opinion does a very good job at reiterating this point. And so it's essential that the legally binding instrument builds on that. And that can be done in many ways. First of all, making the environment explicit across the text. Of course, this is born as a human rights instrument. So of course, most of the references are around human rights abuse, human rights violation, risks, and etc. But our suggestion is to consistently also raise the environmental component next to human rights, whether it's about risk or whether it's also human rights and environmental due diligence. Specifically mentioning the right to healthy environment is very important. We suggest, for instance, including an ad hoc paragraph in the preamble to recall the resolutions that recognized it, but also across relevant articles where mention of existing norms and principles and rights are made. Something that we find particularly important is reiterating the primacy of international human rights law and the centrality of international environmental law. Article 3 is particularly important because it's about what is the scope of this article, and so what should the instrument cover. And so it's very important to really include the broader environmental law and human rights law corpus. But also, there's something quite important in Article 14.5 about the relationship between this legally binding instrument and other agreements like bilateral or multilateral, including trade and investment agreements. That's particularly important if we look at how trade investments agreements are set up. And unfortunately, currently, there are still mechanisms that allow investors to sue states that put in place policies that might undermine the investments, even when the state is putting forward more ambitious human rights, social, labor, or environmental policies. And I think that Article 14.5 here is particularly important to really say that whatever is agreed in these trade and investment agreements shall be implemented and interpreted in a manner that does not undermine human rights obligations and the legally binding instrument itself. Another element worth looking at is who's the victim. So Article 5 of the draft. And so making sure that the scope of this category is broad enough, definitely mentioning specifically environmental human rights defenders. Across the text, the expression human rights defenders, which is broader, is used, but we think that it's important also to mention when relevant the specific category of environmental human rights defenders because of the specific risks they face, but also broadening the scope to those at risk, and so family members of these defenders, witnesses, and so on, really to provide effective protection to all of those that are at risk because of the activities encountering corporate harm. Something that's really at the core of the discussions and also at the core of our publication is the question of prevention liability. We're looking here at Article 6 and 8. And it's really, I think, the main issue at play in this legally binding instrument. What are corporations supposed to do, and when can they be held liable? Currently, as we see, the system that is and the approach that is followed really builds on the guiding principles on business and human rights, whereby there's this due diligence approach, kind of a checklist kind of approach, whereby if a company can, and I'm oversimplifying, can show that they did follow a due diligence process, then it's harder to really establish liability if harm occurs. And here we really want to move forward from that. So it's not enough to mitigate risks, but also to really create a framework that is based on real prevention, and if violation happen, then liability. And in this case, the advisory opinions, both of the International Court of Justice and the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, really help because they introduce this idea of stringent or enhanced due diligence and reiterate the centrality of the precautionary principle. And with this in mind, for instance, we suggest introducing language on the risk of irreparable harm. So whereby some activities should be suspended or completely ceased if they present a risk of irreparable harm. I did mention before human rights impact assessment. We would suggest to broaden the scope of these impact assessments to also include environmental impact assessment, climate change impact assessment, and also what the standards of consultations that are put forward are part of these assessments is. And so establishing that communities have the right to say no, also having ex ante and ex post consultations, really to make sure that also the ex ante work that is conducted is strong enough. And then, as I was saying, what happens if, even if you put in place due diligence approaches, but a harm of course, and then it's the question of liability, going to Article 8, and so really introducing the distinction between due diligence and liability, and we do suggest, for instance, a language that says that due diligence shall not automatically absolve a legal or natural person from liability for causing, contributing, or failing to prevent abuse. And this is really essential to make sure that corporations are held accountable. And we even suggest, in line with some states' suggestions over the year, to introduce a notion of strict liability for those dangerous activities that are carried also in conflict-affected areas. And so that would allow the companies to be held accountable even if they did not act negligently, but because of the enhanced risk of the activity or the context in which the activity happened that justify the strict liability. Another dimension that is really important is the question of access to justice and remedy. On one hand, it's really important to allow collective action, acciones populares, in the context of the environment. This is particularly relevant, and so making sure that this legally binding instrument opens the door to that. And then burden of proof. I realize some of these concepts are quite technical, but they are essential when then justice can be made. And so making sure that the legally binding instruments provides for the reversal of the burden of proof. So it's up to the company to prove that they did not conduct or violate their obligations, and it's not on the victim actually to prove the harm. The question of access to justice also, of course, is essential. We suggest that jurisdiction is also given to courts in states where the abuse has produced effects, not just happened, and that in the context of the triple planetary crisis and climate change specifically is definitely very relevant. And then suggesting the notion of universal jurisdiction for the most serious crimes. Most of the suggestions that I am here listing have come from some delegations. So we're not necessarily reinventing the wheels, but we're uplifting some of the most ambitious suggestions. And similarly to what I was telling before about trade agreements, it might happen that some cases might be heard by arbitration tribunals, and we would suggest including language whereby if a case is referred to an arbitration tribunals, but the case has a human rights component, and this case be referred to a tribunal that actually has competence to decide on human rights violations. Related to the access to justice, of course, is the reparation and access to remedy. So strengthening language on what is the remedy that is needed if a violation occurs. And so in terms of restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, so really making sure that the instrument lists more specifically what remediation and remedy looks like, including in the context of the environment. Final point, we're looking here, of course, at violations by corporate actors in their supply chain, but we shall not forget also the influence that corporate actors have on governance processes and policy making. And here I'm talking about the issue of corporate capture. And there is an article that is quite interesting, and we hope to see in the draft about really setting and implementing transparency mechanisms so that the influence and the vested interest of companies are limited in policy making processes. I realize it's a lot. I hope that you will be still interested in in reading the publication more in detail once it's out. The session will be happening from the 20th to the 24th of October, if I'm not mistaken. So it's going to be interesting to see where states position itself. We don't expect this to be the last round, but definitely, as we were saying, we've seen a shift in approach. Also, some of the work that the experts that have been appointed by the chair has been quite helpful in strengthening the centrality of the environment and also the status of the ratio of the environment. So hopefully this publication can also contribute to informing the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Francesca. That was quite a remarkable description of what needs to be discussed in the coming weeks later this year. So indeed, very, very interesting. We can see the challenge that we have in front of us, and indeed, we look forward to reading the document. Hope there will be a lot of pictures.
We're still trying to find them.
Yeah.
So
Right.
feedback.
It's always frustrating to see these legal documents. There's so little pictures. Well, talking about a treaty, there's another experience, and for once, we would like to see the one on treaty rather contaminate the second one, which is on plastic, and we hope it won't go the other way around. Andrés del Castillo, you're also working with the Center for International Environmental Law, but this time you are here for the center, for Ciel itself, because you were part, I mean, Ciel was part of the big coalition of NGOs who have been following very closely the negotiation of the plastic treaty. And the idea here is perhaps less to discuss about what happened, although there's a lot of very funny and awkward stories to tell, but to try to understand what has really happened and how relevant is it for the wider picture of things which are being negotiated. And here, indeed, there might be a connection between what happened this summer on the plastic treaty and attitudes of some states that can suddenly change or come up when we will be discussing the treaty on transnational corporations. So what is your take? What is your view in following, after you have followed and tried to digest what has happened in this negotiation? Of course, we're talking about the last phases of the negotiation, the meeting, the Inc. 5.2 that happened here, but it means that there were a number of meetings before. So did this start already previously, or did it just come up here in the summer at this meeting here in Geneva? What is your take, and with Ciel's take on that? The floor is yours. Thank you once again. Thank you for being with us, Andrés.
Thanks, Yves. And I think this is a part in the discussion because it's 1 month after the negotiations that we have time to recover and also to gather the different pieces of the puzzle, because in the negotiation it's very complex. You are in different rooms and trying to follow different things at the same time. And if it's difficult for things like that and coalition that follow different things, can't you imagine for countries, developing countries with a few delegates that can need to follow different discussion at the same time? So I guess this is a question of capacity that goes hand by hand with participation of civil society, which usually is very useful for developing countries delegations, which are small delegations, right? And when you play a game at home and you exclude the public, it's like excluding the 12th player. And this is what is happening in the plastics treaty negotiations. And we have seen this practice since INC 3 and 4, I will say, that they start to close different doors of the negotiation to say, let's just put the negotiators and observers are out of the negotiation. There are pros and cons on that. Sometimes when you have as stakeholders, the industry, and there are delegates that they don't want to speak when the industry is involved, there's some advantage of having that discussion. There are things that they won't say publicly, and we understand that. But that is totally different what's happening with the plastic treaty. That is mainly a discussion that starts public, and after 1 or 2, 3 days becomes really narrow and only open to delegates. So participation is very, very important, and this goes with the procedural rights in general. And when we talk about the right to be free from toxics as an element of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, we understand that the procedural part of that is as important, right? And we have conventions like the Aarhus Convention that goes further and discuss the question of participation within international fora, right? That is already following both the transnational negotiation and the plastic treaty negotiations there. However, the question of participation is crucial, and this is one of the main reasons or factors of the failure too, right? We have seen that during the different discussions, there's something that we call intersessional work, that is what happened in between meetings, and there's a practice during intersessional work that is called head of delegations, that is may exclude observers from participating in informal kind of negotiations, and this needs to change because we need more public participation, meaningful public participation in not only during the negotiation, but also in between negotiations. And by having said that, I want to also mention some positive things that happened during the negotiation, and is so how formally some countries came together to put for the first time a proposal for a CRP on human rights, which includes some specific language for the preamble and for principles on human rights that need to be explicitly include as language within the treaty text, right? We have also a CRP on indigenous people's rights and some language there. That is something to highlight, and a CRP on health, and to have a dedicated article on health, right, within the plastic treaty. And also a proposal for a remediation fund, which goes hand by hand with the access to justice and to reparation, which this is something that need to be highlighted because there was some work that was done there. The problem is that at the end was ignored, right? And when you see some of the final documents of draft, you don't see, that doesn't reflect what's happening internally. And this is why the reason why many countries were upset, saying that this is not representing what was discussed in the room. So I will say that one of the main gaps was also to make sure that those things are included in whatever text will be negotiated. And finally, something which is important to mention is linked to the toxic part is, yes, a dedicated article on health is important, but the article on health for the plastic treaty will be how we're going to control products and chemicals. And this is getting weak and weak and weak. At the beginning, we had a standalone provision on chemicals of concern in plastics. We know that there are more than 16,000 chemicals that has been used in plastics, for more than 4,000 chemicals that are chemicals of concern. And we have now a provision that is a mix between products and chemicals that is not clear at all. And the main problem there, and is linked to the idea of the precautionary principle, that is linked to the idea of when you go to the original definition of what is pollution, that is a definition that GISAMP gave in 1969 and is now under UNCLOS. You have under the UNCLOS definition of pollution, the hazardous based idea that comes with the idea of the precautionary principle, right? Like the pollution doesn't need to cause harm, but the potentiality to cause harm is there. And we have that in UNCLOS, right? But when you look at, okay, how we're going to measure that, and you see how that is translated on how we're going to assess that, or countries will do that, they are focusing on old school idea of risk-based approach. And here, bear with me with this idea of what is the difference and the implication of the risk-based approach versus a hazards-based approach, and in between the exposure-based approach when it comes to chemicals. And by a risk-based approach assessment, we understand that what you assess is the probability of the harm occurring from hazards, incorporating factors like exposure. But when it comes to hazards-based approach, you go to the intrinsic properties of the substance to determine that, and then exposure can be a factor too, right? And when it comes to access to justice, how do you translate that? Is in the word of proof. Who is going to prove, and what is the length of the time to prove the causation of attribution of that one chemical that is poisoning you. It's very hard for communities or for individuals to prove that. So by using and by establishing a specific law using a hazard-based approach is the best way to protect human rights instead of just the risk-based approach if we want to talk about toxics. So I want to stop here by saying like those are things that are connected, and what we expect in the next negotiation is that first, more participation that is guaranteed in between negotiations, during the negotiation too, but also the question of access to information needs to be included there. Explicit language to human rights needs to be there. Indigenous peoples too, and other vulnerable communities like waste speakers and coastal communities too. And finally, that this hazards-based approach is embedded into the plastic treaty.
Thank you very much, Andres. Very, very complete also, and very, very interesting. I will have a question, but perhaps I can raise it immediately. In addition to what you said, because you're really describing the process and how it went further and how it was blocked at several moments. But I was wondering if isn't there also some kind of an underlying new element which is coming and that we saw grow over the time in these discussions on the plastic treaty, which were different from what was still going on in other places, even Basel Convention, the BRS, and so on, which you have a group of states now who are ready to say, no, we're ready not to play the game anymore as it's used. When there was some kind of an agreement all the time, so when you have these negotiations, we know that there is a disagreement, but we understand why we're doing it, and that's what we call the landing zone. And in a way, you have the impression, but perhaps my impression is wrong. I'd really like to hear what you think about that some now are ready to engage without any landing zone. And this, of course, changes the whole scene and the whole game, if I can put it like that. What is your impression of that?
Yes, this is a very good question. I think that there are three groups of countries or positions from countries during the negotiations. One is the countries that they want an ambitious treaty. The others is the countries that want a treaty but not as ambitious. And then you have the ones that they don't want anything. And we have seen a crystallization of this coalition of the willing countries, which is a majority. We don't like that name. We're trying to find a better name to call those ambitious countries. That may be the coalition of consumer countries. Because that represent only 20% of the production of plastics, but a few countries decide what are the products that they will kind of export to this country. So, however, there are countries that are willing to have something and to keep negotiating. And here, the difference is that it's clear that there are countries that they don't want a treaty. So the multilateralism is important, but we need to change the idea that for something to be multilateral, need to be universally accepted. That comes with the Paris Agreement, right? We have internally something inside. We need the minimum in order to get something and everybody on board, which is not the case. I will maybe mention how the Montreal Protocol was not at the beginning adopted by the majority of the countries, where like 87 countries that at the beginning adopted, and little by little, you got the other countries into that. But we don't want from the other side the Treaty of the Moon. There is a Treaty of the Moon, right? But it's a treaty that you don't have enough countries ratifying either, even if it's a very important treaty, right? It's the right balance where you want to stay. So keep the negotiation is important, but not with the same logic or rules that we are playing right now, because we are now under the rule of consensus, and this is not working.
Yeah, so there is a bit of a new rule we have to start to work with, and it's the beginning, I think, of the strategizing on this. Well, thank you very much for these presentations. Let me turn now back to you, Marcus. We heard from Alison that very rightly so, there is a need to change approaches and to have a more holistic approach. Precisely, this is that's the way I heard it, at least, what is being followed by this study on how the environment should be in the Treaty on Transnational Cooperation, precisely to be holistic, to make all the different connections, so that it makes sense once it comes out as a treaty with already existing obligation. And of course, what we have just discussed now with the plastic treaty, where we see that indeed we need to perhaps develop some new thinking to trying to get out of a new blockage, which is appearing and that has played very, very strongly here in Geneva during the last summer. What is your take as Special Rapporteur, who's been pushing so much on having this issue of having the right to live a life free of toxics? How do you see this being able to progress in this current context? An easy question.
Right. Thank you so much, Yves, and thanks to the three presenters. So please allow me to offer a couple reactions. First on mercury use in small-scale gold mining. As you may recall, I presented a thematic report to the Human Rights Council on this issue and have engaged the Minamata various conferences of the parties for a number of years. I had the opportunity to participate in the recent regional preparatory meeting of the GRULAC, the Latin American and the Caribbean, where I spoke about the strengths of Minamata and, for example, its life cycle approach, sources, mercury in products, trade in mercury, wastes, a number of issues. Minamata is still the youngest in the family of MEAs, and that means that it has incorporated lessons learned from what came before. So it's a strong treaty, and it is working. It is working to phase out mercury in products. It's working to phase out mercury in certain industrial processes. I can get into the examples of light bulbs or dental amalgams or the production of chlorine through mercury cells and so forth. But the lion's share is small scale mining in terms of emissions and releases. And there, the treaty exhibits a huge gap because it considers that gold mining is a use allowed for mercury, or mercury is allowed for use in gold mining. So that's a huge gap because, among other things, it means that international trade for mercury in small scale gold mining is allowed, except for primary mercury. You can get into the nuances in a minute. So the gaps of Minamata need to be addressed. As Alison mentioned, there are thousands of people that depend and rely on this activity. And so there's elements of just transition. But let's recall that just transition is not a concept for paralysis, to do nothing. It's a concept to leave no one behind, knowing that change must be effected. And here the change that needs to happen is the transition to mercury-free mining, because mercury results in a range of serious violations of human rights, generation of sacrifice zones, intergenerational problems, so future generations and so forth. And so those gaps need to be addressed, and the fact that there are many people living in poverty that rely on gold mining using mercury is not a reason not to move forward. It is a reason not to leave them behind and for governments to intervene so that they're not left behind. But mercury use in gold scale mining should be addressed as a criminal act, like the traffic of ozone depleting substances, like the traffic in hazardous waste and other forms of environmental crime. So I thought I'd make that first remark. Secondly, and this gets more at your question, there's a sense of irony that a human rights treaty is finding it hard to integrate environment, and that an environmental treaty, to give it a label, is finding it hard to integrate human rights. Why is that happening? Well, it happens, I guess, because we're still seeing a lot of siloed mentality, where human rights are in Geneva, even though the plastic negotiations last INC took place here, and environment is in Nairobi. And so this played out in those terms during the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. Go to Nairobi, there was some would say, or go to Geneva. So the need for integration, and why the emphasis on integration? Well, for legitimacy certainly, but because for agreements to be effective, they need to tackle root causes and the multiplicity of dimensions that are involved. And plastics is not just about environment. We know this by now. It involves fossil fuels, it involves trade, biodiversity, it involves health, it involves chemicals. And so a lasting and effective solution to the plastic pollution problem is not just looking at the sea, which of course it's important, but it's also looking at the root causes of and the whole life cycle. And this is something I elaborate in my thematic report on plastics and human rights. And similarly, on the TNC treaty process, I was a senior attorney at the time the resolution was passed by the Human Rights Council. I was here doing advocacy for that resolution, working very closely with delegations of Ecuador and South Africa. And the time, and I do recall that the environment was very much, since the outset, a big part of that discussion. And so it did come as a surprise that that the environment was in a way watered down through various iterations of drafts that have come about that process. I have been able to engage the process from time to time, contributing comments, such as on the importance of statute of limitations in connection with toxics and latency period. And so I sense that there may be a good opportunity for the 24 guidelines on access to justice and effective remedies in the context of toxics that are included in my last thematic report to feed into and further inform the environmental and human rights dimensions of that treaty. And so I'd be very interested in working with you and collaborating on finding ways to do that. But back to your point, I think the key challenge is precisely to get out of these silos and to look at the bridge and to build bridges and to look at the integration. Now, that's of course easier said than done. At an institutional level, it means challenging mandates at times. It means budgets. Organizations are so zealous of their sphere of authority and their budget. But without integration, we may not be in a position to adequately solve the problems that humanity is facing in regards to the right to be free from toxics.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus, Orellana, for these thoughts, and which we can take almost as concluding remarks. And let me also thank the different contributions we've heard. I think it was really very thoughtful. We're going to need a number of other discussions like that. This needs to be continued in order to take stock of where we are right now in the different process. And to be sure that we're at the head of the curve. We're not sure that was the case in the summer, and we're trying to see what is the curve. So that's still a bit the question where we are right now. But I think we've heard also some of the progress that has been made. I think, as it was said also by Diana at the beginning, with all of these different Geneva toxic-free talks over the years, since COVID, actually, we've been witnessing in these discussions some of the progress that have been done in different fields. So we really look forward to be able to continue like that. And also, if you had one final word you wanted to share with us, Marcus, before we close the meeting.
The final word I wish to share is thank you. Thank Diana. Thank you, Yves. Thanks all of you in the room. It has been really, really exciting to have the opportunity over these last few years to engage and to have these insightful conversations in the Geneva Toxic Free Talks. And now that my time is coming to an end, I can look back and breathe deeply and with a sense of satisfaction to say thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you for having attended all of these meetings and helped us in informing them. And if ever you forgot one, you can always catch it because they're all available on the site of the Geneva Environmental Network. I'd like also to add my thanks to yours, especially this year. This edition of the Geneva Toxic Free Talks have been particularly hectic and difficult. For those who are following online, you can't see it, but due to renovation of the buildings, everything is moved in other places, and it's not as convenient. A lot of the habits we have been lost. Events have been moved at the very last minute, so it's been extremely difficult. It's always been difficult. It's always been a challenge, but this time we really reached a summit. So without the constant work and the incredible support from all of the team of the Geneva Environmental Network, it would have really been impossible to have any of these events, all of the events we had today. So a very, very big thank you to the whole team, and also thank you to you for participating to this discussion. And please join me in uploading the contribution we had. It was really also very, very thoughtful. Thank you very much. And now I hand it back to you, Daniela.
I think now it's time for the traditional photo of the end. I think, yeah, we have to it all. So thank you all for staying with us. It's 5 p.m. Geneva time. And I know that some of you still have a few other meetings to attend. I think we can formally close and go for the formal photo.
Great.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Say over.
Is Richard Beer still involved in the